Thank you for tuning in to the Let My People Go webinar, Moving Forward, Learning to Love Your Neighbors in the Aftermath of COVID. As many of you know, Let My People Go exists to empower the local church to fight human trafficking by loving those most vulnerable. And as we look at what is happening during this pandemic, we have to realize that those who were already vulnerable are having their vulnerability exacerbated, and those who didn't feel the pangs of vulnerability prior to the pandemic are now wrestling with, what does it look like to find a new job? What does it look like to live with a spouse who could be abusive? There are people who are experiencing things now through the pressure of the pandemic that would have probably not experienced these things in another situation. So for us, as we're moving forward through this webinar, I will pause after each slide to give you the opportunity to take notes, to kind of collect your thoughts, rather than just barreling through this information. As we think about what's happening during COVID, we have to remember that though the pandemic is horrific, it's revealing other things about our society. It's highlighting other issues that are going on in our communities. And for us to really understand how the pandemic and COVID dovetails with human trafficking, we have to understand that human trafficking is ultimately the exploitation of vulnerability for commercial gain. Whether it's for sex, labor, or domestic servitude, traffickers find people who have less power and status than they do, and they exploit that, they leverage that. So it's not always going to be someone who abducts someone in your community. A lot of us have seen the movie Taken, and we see that and we're like, okay, well, all human trafficking is through kidnapping. It's all through abduction. Well, statistics say that less than 5% of human trafficking is through abduction. But the majority of human trafficking happens through grooming. This is where someone manipulates and molds someone into the image they want them to be so that they can profit off of them. And oftentimes, this is not a stranger danger scenario. This is someone who is known to the victim. It may be a family member. It may be a so-called boyfriend. It may be an uncle, maybe a boss, maybe a teacher, maybe a pastor for that matter. But it's often someone that is known by the person experiencing this exploitation. For us to rethink human trafficking, we also have to rethink vulnerability. It's so easy to think vulnerability is a bad thing, so we run from it. We try to lead by our strengths. That's why there are 500 different variations of Strength Finder surveys. If we just focus on the things that we're good at, then we won't have to worry about the things that we're bad at. But what we find in Scripture over and over and over is this idea that in our weakness, we can find our strength, because Christ became weak for us. When we are weak, we are strong. We see this theme play out throughout Scripture. In my book, Vulnerable: Rethinking Human Trafficking, I have one main point, and it's simple. God motivates vulnerable people like you and I to love those most vulnerable around us by becoming vulnerable for us. There's this golden thread of vulnerability that goes throughout the biblical canon. And so we have to rethink vulnerability to the point that we say, this isn't just some bad thing to be avoided, but the very thing that disqualifies us may be the thing that qualifies us to serve our most vulnerable neighbor. This may be the thing that puts us on a level playing field with the person that we're trying to serve. They may have different needs, they may have different issues that they're facing, but at the end of the day, we all have needs, and we are all in need of care and love. And so we can serve out of our vulnerability in a way that welcomes our neighbor who's experiencing theirs. And to rethink vulnerability, we have to rethink mobilization, because it's so easy for organizations like mine and other organizations working in Christian social action to go to a church and say, you know what? We want to help you help us do the thing that we want to do. But what we're saying is everyone in this church is vulnerable. And so what would it look like to mobilize everyone in the pew or the chairs, everyone who's already attending, to love their neighbor? Because your vulnerable neighbor is there. Whether you see them or not, that's another issue altogether, but they are in your community. And what would it look like if we were able to serve them and engage them? So Let My People Go, as we empower the local church, our goal is to help everyone in the church do something to love the neighbor that they cross paths with on a daily basis. So first steps. I know that we're all in survival mode right now. And it's important to know that your community's needs are already shifting, but they will continue to shift as this wears on and as churches begin to open up and as society begins to open up. And so what the purpose of this webinar is to help you make some wise decisions as you think through what can our church do in light of the issues that our community is facing, and how can we identify and respond to our neighbor. The first thing you can do to recognize and respond to your neighbor is to focus on your local community. It's very easy to focus on what is happening around you, around the world, globally. With the internet and different resources at our fingertips, it's so easy to say, well, this is happening in this country, and this is happening in that country. And we should serve globally, but we should also serve locally. And so what would it look like to really bear down and identify the needs that are happening around you? And so this is where Let My People Go starts when we partner with churches. So as you're getting ready to move forward into the next season where you reopen your church and you try to serve your newly vulnerable people as well as those who've been vulnerable, we want you to focus on your local community. And to do this, we advocate creating a team. Every time Let My People Go partners with a church, we help them create what we call a justice ministry team. This is a team of people who have prior experience working with vulnerable populations. It may be a school teacher, it may be a Sunday school teacher, it may be a doctor, a lawyer, a police officer. It may be someone in social services, someone in a local nonprofit. It may be someone who's just unbelievably compassionate, someone who's led ministries in the church before. And this team will ultimately go into the local community to identify the needs that are there, but they will also work with the pastoral team to help the church develop a congregational response to the needs that they discover. And so the first act of this justice ministry team, or the team that you create in your community, is to assess the needs of your community. To do this, we advocate using a community needs assessment. Let My People Go has a special practical community needs assessment that combines both your traditional needs assessments with your assets-based approach. And we send each member of the team out into the community to have interviews. Yes, interpersonal interviews with local stakeholders. It's very easy to solely focus on what we can find on the internet, but there has to be an interpersonal layer. Yes, you can Google right now, you can Google nonprofits and your zip code, nonprofits and your neighborhood, and look and see what comes up. And you may find 5 organizations working with at-risk youth, while only 1 organization is working with those experiencing homelessness. This is good and it gives you a place to start, but you cannot skip over setting these appointments and giving yourself 3 to 6 months to find, interview, and assess your findings. And you may talk to someone in a local nonprofit and they may say, well, what we've found is those who are experiencing homelessness are those most vulnerable. But then someone in social services may say, but those who have experienced cyclical poverty are, or those who've experienced substance abuse, or those who have been impacted by incarceration, or our immigrant neighbors. We want you to have every one of these conversations and really ask them, who is most vulnerable in our community? What are the needs? What's working here and what's not? And who else can we talk to? And as you collect all this information, you bring it back to your justice ministry team and you assess the findings. What bubbles to the top? Who is most vulnerable in your community? What vulnerabilities are most prevalent? Because it's going to be very easy to say, wow, let's work with everything. But every community has one need that might be head and shoulders above the others. And we want you to find that need. We believe it's important. And to do this, you have to focus on relationships. That's why we have an interpersonal angle. That's why we develop a team who works together to work with these potential partners to identify these needs. And when you have these conversations, write down the name of your contact at the organization. Write down their phone number. You will need this later as you develop resources for your congregational approach. Relationships are key because you're not only having relationships with potential collaborators and relationships with each other in church. We want you to have relationships with those most vulnerable themselves, because it's so easy to just plug someone away in a program and not love them interpersonally. It's easy to see someone as a project and not a person. And Let My People Go stands against this in all its forms. We believe that personhood is critical to the image of Christ that is on display in every one of us. And so focusing on relationships is key to running a healthy ministry to your neighbor. As you do this, you have to focus your approach. As you are doing the assessment, like I said, you need to see what bubbles to the top and say, okay, we found 2 needs that we have to focus on. Great. We found 1 need that we have to focus on. Your church may already be working with vulnerable people. I ask you, do the assessment and see if that group is still the most vulnerable population in your community, because you may not know. It's easy to assume we know, but it's not until we talk to people that it becomes unbelievably obvious. So focusing your approach, finding a way to really make it narrow enough to where you can see success and you can see your failure. For us to do this, we want it to be very clear for your congregation, because if it's not clear, then it's going to be very easy for your congregation to feel overwhelmed and alone. And what will happen is you'll start this, and 6 months later, you will quit because you will be so overwhelmed. And now you've left your community worse off than you found it. And so that we don't give up, so that we don't give in, we have to lead with a spirit of collaboration. This is why Let My People Go collaborates with the local church, because we want to help the church get past their hurdles. But this is also why Let My People Go encourages and teaches mutually beneficial collaboration with local stakeholders, because there will be things as you are finding the need in your community that maybe I won't be best suited to teach you, but your collaborative agencies will. So when you identify, oh, well, those most vulnerable are those who are new immigrants. Well, if you're partnering with an organization that you interviewed in the community needs assessment and they work with immigrant neighbors, then collaborate with them. Have them come in and do a training for your justice ministry team. Have them come in and speak behind the pulpit for 10 to 15 minutes to the entire service. Do this because this will ultimately lead to flourishing in your community, because your church doesn't have to do everything. You don't have to have the biggest budget. What you do have to do is to collaborate and find people that can walk alongside with you. And you have to build your partnerships. One thing that the community needs assessment will do is it will identify those most vulnerable. And then the team will share this with the pastoral leadership team. The pastoral leadership team will preach 8 to 12 times a year and say, as a congregation, we're going to partner with our local collaborative partnerships. And we're going to partner with this organization working with those experiencing homelessness, or those working with, name your community vulnerability. And as a congregation, we're going to do fill in the blank. And as small groups, we're going to do fill in the blank once every quarter. Getting your church to get their hands dirty in these partnerships is so important. because it shows your church that there are other people outside of the four walls, and hearing it from the pulpit is of utmost importance. This is how we build partnerships, and this is how we collaborate well. Let My People Go wants to create a congregational model as well as a collaborative one, motivated by the gospel. When you realize that you're free to focus on another organization, not just your church. Another thing that we have to do as we are reaching new people is to be trauma informed. We have to think through, how does our space and the way that it's set up impact those who've experienced physical, emotional, psychological, or spiritual trauma? How do the words that we use in our sermons impact those who have experienced trauma? It's very easy for me when I speak to say, well, God used me. God did this in my life. God used me for his glory. That's great, but when someone has been used by an exploiter or a manipulator, that can be a trigger. And so really thinking through what it means to be trauma informed. Let My People Go provides materials here, and there are also great materials provided by people like Dr. Diane Langberg and Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in Christian Environments. These are people who are really doing good work in the trauma-informed area. But Let My People Go will also continually seek to develop more resources to help your church be more trauma-informed, because it's so important. We're all at different places, and we don't want to hurt the people we're trying to help. And one of the key things to not hurting people is to know our own vulnerability. It's easy to operate from a pedestal. It's easy to act as if we have it all together. But like I said earlier, we all have issues. And when we know, wow, I've experienced vulnerability, I've experienced trauma, I've experienced these things, it puts us on a level playing field. But we also have to understand that when we're caring for people, their brokenness can splash against ours, and it can create responses. We can have trauma responses. We can be mean. We can be harsh. We can want to quit. We can want to quit because we feel hurt. Sometimes we start to feel what we think is burnout, and it's actually not. It's vicarious trauma. It's secondary trauma. Our brain, because of the people that we're working with and the stories that we're hearing, thinks that we endured those things. And so we must know our vulnerability so that we can take care of ourselves. And to do that, we have to create a strict self-care routine. Self-care is so important. We have to answer the question, how do we rest before we burn out? How do we rest preemptively? What is our rhythm? And so what Let My People Go does is we think in terms of 3 different rhythms. A rhythm of rest. How are we resting daily? For me, daily, I like to walk. This is how I rest. This is how I get outside of my head. This is how I see the world. And so I walk. I also give myself 10 to 15 minutes a day where I just lay on my bed and think. I don't cook, I don't clean, I don't read, I don't do any of these things during this time. I just practice stillness. That's what I do daily. Weekly, what is your rhythm? I don't work on Saturdays. I never work on Saturdays. What is your rhythm weekly? Some of you, you may take an entire weekend off and you don't answer the phone for business from 5 p.m. Friday night to 8 a.m. Sunday morning, or Monday morning rather. What does it look like to create a monthly self-care routine? What does it look like for you to get away, to take a break, to get away for a weekend or a week every few months? And so that's how we do rest, but we also need to have a rhythm of relationships. How are we encouraging community? In this pandemic, it's been very tricky, but we have risen above it in very amazing ways. Many of us are using different apps. Many of us are talking to people in safe ways from, we're social distancing, of course, but we are still communicating with people because we're realizing we cannot be alone. I feel that this pandemic has forced me to practice a more healthy rhythm of relationship. And probably many of you, if you're honest, you would say the same thing. What does it look like to have healthy community in your life? What are the daily conversations you're having? What are the weekly conversations? Who is your inner circle? Who is your outer circle? These are questions to answer. Another rhythm to think through is your rhythm of remembrance. How are we remembering God's work in our life? How are we remembering his finished work, the gospel? Because if we are loving people because we feel that we have to, we're doing it wrong. You have nothing to do to earn God's favor because it's been done by Christ. So now that you have nothing to do, what will you do? So we practice these rhythms of rest, relationship, and remembrance. And we see these rhythms at play throughout the life of Jesus in the gospel. He would get away and pray and be still. He would get away with his friends and they would eat and they would laugh together, his disciples. He would go to religious festivals where he would remember what God has done on behalf of Israel, whom he is now embodying. We see self-care not as self-help, but as something that the gospel motivates. Again, Let My People Go exists to empower your church to fight human trafficking. And we do not want you to do this alone. So if you want to partner with Let My People Go, I ask you, find us online. Our website is www.lmpgnetwork.org. lmpgnetwork.org. And you will find there several resources, including a clickable document that has this information. We encourage you to use this and to really do this in collaboration with an organization like Let My People Go, to do this in collaboration with local stakeholders, because those most vulnerable in your community are worth it, because your church is worth it, and we know that God will work through this. Thank you so much for your time.